Okay, here we go. Dave, sit down.
What's the name of the wait? Wayne.
Hold it.
What's the name of this piece? My love. And 5.
She's a great singer. Okay.
4. And welcome back to Live from the Heartland. We are here like we are every Saturday morning from 9 to 10 in the morning. We just listened to Wayna's My Love, and that was Wayna.
Wayna. She goes by Wayna. She's got a couple other names, but just Wayna is what you want to remember.
Exactly. And she's got the CD that we just were listening to is Expats. And you can find her on YouTube. And you'll also...
We're talking internationalism. We're talking about people and getting along and the music blending together. One of the things that has been a force, I think, in the world has been sport. And we go way back. We know that athletes competed against each other, and warring sections of Greece, etc., would lay down their arms and allow the athletes to travel and meet each other. And on that note, we've got the founder of Athletes United for Peace, the current president of Athletes United for Peace. First, we have Phil Shinnick, who is a good pal, and we have Dave Meggyesy, another good pal, and we got Dave Zirin sending us text messages.
He wants to know if you got his email, Dave.
Not yet.
Okay, not yet,
Those
Dave.
of you who know Dave Zirin, he's a guy you want to be paying attention to, writes for the Nation, etc. Good morning, Phil. Good morning, Dave.
Good morning, Michael. Good morning, Katie.
To be real close to it.
Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning.
Welcome, you guys. Nice to have you.
Thank you.
And I want to know right off the bat, since you guys came in a couple nights ago and saw that movie that we had the
Trials of Muhammad Ali at the Music Box.
And we had the director of that on a couple of weeks ago. How'd you like that flick, first of all? One question.
Yeah.
Is it okay?
Oh yeah, it's a good question. Yeah.
No, how about the film?
No, it was
Bill Siegel's film.
It was wonderful to see it. The life behind the boxing life, which I had never fully appreciated before, and the content of Ali's message to hundreds of thousands of students, because for 3.5 years he was on the circuit and he was really talking to the students. That to me was a very important piece of it.
It was amazing. He showed things that hadn't been shown before.
And Phil actually, and maybe if you want to talk about it, Phil spent a whole day with him, and Ali was an extraordinarily sharp, bright, aware human being who really was into seeing the necessity of changing the way things are being done on the planet, and he was articulating that view of progressive humanity.
Let's get that story.
So
Let's Phil tell us a little bit about the time the two Olympians hung out and compared bodies.
Yeah.
Compared bodies?
Yeah, they compared bodies. Yeah.
Oh, you guys are so kinky.
It's not vain, but it's,
wait until I talk and you'll see that this was an extraordinary thing. This was back in 1974. I was an athletic director at Rutgers and a professor there, and I was hiding back in the storage room trying to do the budget, and all of a sudden this guy walks in, and it's Muhammad Ali. This is about 7:45 in the morning, and I said, Muhammad, you're not supposed to be here till 7 o'clock at night. You're going to give a speech, and you live in Cherry Hill, and Cherry Hill's an hour and a half from here, so that means you got up pretty early to get here. And he says, yeah, I got up at 4 because I wanted to come and see you. And I said, oh? And he said, yeah, because I heard that you knew Joe Frazier. So I said, yeah, he was on the Olympic team with me. We hung out together. We went to art galleries. We spent a lot of time. And he said,
art galleries.
And which Olympics?
64.
64.
He was a gold medalist, and of course Ali was the gold medalist in 1960.
60, right.
So he says to me, what about Joe Frazier? And I says, well, Joe Frazier, when I was with him, he had a cast on his hand. And he said, oh? And he says, yeah, he broke his hand in the second round of the Olympics, and he boxed 2 more rounds with a broken hand and won the gold medal. So the guy's a tough guy. And he says, well, how big is he? And I said, well, he's about 5'10", 5'11", maybe 180, 185 pounds. And so he said, no, I want you to go through the first time you met him. And I said, well, it was on a bus. And so I had to go through every single conversation.
Really?
So then he looks at me and he says, I hear that you're a great athlete and you broke the world record and you're pretty strong. And I said, well, you don't want to go out and do some bench, because I have my weights out there. And I said, yeah, I'm lifting weights. I'm going to lift weights. You want to lift weights with me? And he said, he opens his briefcase and he pulls out a tape measure. And he said, I want to measure you. So he comes over.
What'd I tell you? Kinky.
And so he comes over and he measures my thigh. Then he measured his thigh.
I don't know how far we should go with this.
All right, kid. I've heard this.
We're getting there. We're getting there. We're getting there.
Phil Shinnick, rap on.
So then he measures the neck, he measures everything, and basically the difference is his deltoids were a little bit bigger, but the biceps were the same, and his hands are not big. I can't palm a ball. His hands aren't big, and we measured ourselves, their height, and he was 6'4", 180, just like me. So he said, well, you know, you could be my brother. And so then...
And then did you say, I am, brother? I am.
So then he wanted to talk about slavery. Then he wanted to talk about women. And he says, I personally prefer the Islamic women because they're really family-oriented. And I think he was married to an Islamic woman at that time. Mm-hmm. And so then we talked about the basis of slavery. And he said, well, the basis is racism. And I said, what about the Irish in the 13th century who were taken by the Algerians into slavery when they came down into the Mediterranean? So we went through the whole history of slavery. And then we went through the history of colonization in Africa. And then we went through the whole relationship.
And all of a sudden it was 7 p.m. and time for his talk.
Well, this was 11:30, so we're 4 hours later, and then he looks at me and he snaps his briefcase again and he opens it up and he said, I want you to read this. And there were his poems. So I pulled out a poem and he says, now read it. And so I read the poem, and this took 2 hours. He had 300 poems. And so the whole, but every poem had the same theme. The same theme. And what's the theme? He says, if an athlete doesn't get in their body, in their heart, they are lost. They are absolutely lost. If you don't have spirit, and you don't have mind, and you don't have body together, you can't do it. And it's true, because, you know, when you're boxing and you're tired, you've got to have a resource, a reservoir, and the reservoir is in the body. Right. So he's my kind of athlete.
So he was talking the mind-body thing.
And politics.
In the late 60s, before Aquarian Conspiracy ever came out.
So that's my story.
Well,
that's a good story.
Phil, I would, you know, we've shared a lot of stories, but why don't you talk a little bit about how Athletes United for Peace came to be? You were involved with a group in New York called Sports for the People, and I was working in Rising Up Angry, and we heard about you guys, and you were kind of inspirational. We actually set up a Sports for the People with volleyball. That's where I actually, Katie and I first played some volleyball together, and then we brought Dave to town. He had done his book Out of Their League, and we traveled around. We met with the Northwestern football team, went to the YMCA college. Not too much longer, I think in 1980, you actually started Athletes United for Peace along with John Thomas. Tell us about the kind of origins of Athletes United for Peace and how you came to start it and bring the Russian team or the Soviet team to the Kansas relays.
Well, the first step is really what Dave Meggyesy and I were involved in clear back in 1968, which is that if you remember in the 60s, there were no women's sports, there was a lot of racism in terms of coaches and stuff. Right. There was really no mass sports, and so
no sports for the people.
Yeah, no sports for the people, and so we spent, I don't know, 10 or 15 years working on the things that you were working on, getting Run for Fun, Sports for the People, and
we were working off the Chinese slogan, friendship first, competition second.
So that's the first aspect. The second aspect is China was not in the Olympics. And I competed in the Olympics, and you're supposed to be the world champion. But how can you be the world champion when 3 billion people are not in the Olympics?
Not into it.
So the early part of the two parts of Athletes United for Peace, which is sports for the people and the international problems. So then I took a delegation to China, and we started working on the most serious problem at that time, the war in Vietnam, and also the proliferation of nuclear arms. So then John Thomas and Olympic athletes who had competed in Russia, I competed in 1969 in the Soviet Union, and so I had friends there. So I started having interactions with my buddies, Igor Tarabanishin, whose world record that I broke, and we started making a coalition and started doing peace things. Dave set up a thing in St. Louis where the U.S. and the Soviet soccer team played together, and we got
I never heard that story.
Yeah,
Dave.
this was, and the owners of the Busch Stadium supported it.
Yeah.
And so then we had the athletes.
That would be Budweiser.
Yeah, we had the athletes come together and to make a peace statement, and then we bought 10 dozen roses, and the athletes went and went around the stadium and threw the flowers up into the stands. Soviet athletes, U.S. athletes, and then they played the soccer match. But we did probably 50 of these kinds of things. We also founded the Moscow Marathon, and the people that I was working on we founded the New York City Marathon with Fred Lebow. So I took Fred Lebow to the Soviet Union, and we had these relationships. So Athletes United for Peace had two prongs. Number one, sports for the people, things, the domestic, all sorts of problems, and at the same time, a really consciousness of global problems. And that's essentially what we've done over the years.
And David, when did you get involved? I mean, you were involved in the progressive sports movement, but fill us in.
Well, my involvement, I started coming into the movement. When I was in college, I read a book called The Other America by Michael Harrington, and it was about poverty in America. And it was like 20 million people, even more than that, went to bed hungry every night. And I was trying to figure out the contradiction between that and that was in the taking place in the richest country in the world, the United States at the time, and what was that all about. So I began to explore that relationship. I mean, I grew up on a pig farm next to a dynamite factory, and we didn't have food in a lot of times. So I was sensitized to that issue. And so I began looking at that and really looking at how the St. Louis Cardinal football team was being run and the amount of racism involved and stacking black athletes into positions and not letting them play certain positions like quarterback and center and the offensive line and offensive guard position, linebacker. At that time was pretty exclusively white, and the other positions had about half and half African American and Anglo players. At any rate, I started looking at sport as an institution and could see what I was seeing in society with the civil rights movement was the same thing going on with the Cardinals. And so I was involved with that part of it with the Cardinals. And then got involved in the anti-war movement, and one of the things we did was we had 34 Cardinals sign an anti-war petition, and our squad size was around 40. So most of my teammates signed this petition, which really surprised me because there were a lot of guys from the South who I didn't know very well, and I thought they would be opposed to it, but it turns out they were very much in support of it. And so doing that basically got me in hot water with the management, and so they basically benched me. And
well, you weren't getting up to salute the flag, right? As I recall.
And then I did a thing where I didn't. Tommy Smith and John Carlos, and I have to say this about those guys and Muhammad Ali, they were a great inspiration to a lot of us athletes and professional athletes. And when the order came down from Pete Rozelle that we all had to stand along the sidelines and hold our helmet under our left arm and put our right hand over our chest and look at the American flag while the national anthem was playing.
And the bombers flew overhead.
And bombers flew overhead. I didn't do that, and so I hung my head down and my helmet down, and the press obviously saw it, and then they wrote some columns about that the team was infested with the communists, and then they hung a sign on the inside of the banner saying the Big Red, which was our moniker. The Big Red was the Cardinals. Thinks pink. In other words,
Wow.
the Cardinals were infested with these communists. Guess who that was?
Well, I remember.
At any rate, you're getting me off on these stories. Too much coffee this morning.
I'm surrounded by guys who had too much coffee.
Yeah, too much coffee. So at any rate, then I met Phil, and when I wrote out my book Out of Their League, and I met Phil, and Phil and I have been close friends for 50 years almost.
Yeah, since 1968. Yeah.
68, and so we were involved in what we called the athletic revolution at the time, which was, from my view, to bring the athletes into the progressive movement that was really exploding in the United States then, around the anti-war movement, the women's movement, the civil rights movement. And so I saw my book as helping to do that.
Yeah.
And then we evolved into the Athletes United for Peace. So, long story.
Well, it's really actually only a piece. I've heard long stories from you, Dave Meggyesy, and that was not one of them. That was a brief intro that
brief
brought
intro,
everybody to you.
Yes.
But I'll tell you what, I love the fact that I read your book as a 21-year-old
Right.
out of a football family on the South Side.
Yeah.
And after I read it, it was paperback, and I gave it to my father and told him, you should read this. And it was about 3 years or 4 years later that I met Michael, who was already your good buddy.
Yeah, we met way back.
And then I met you also in that first year that I knew Michael, and I thought it was just amazing. In fact, my nephew, who I gave your book to a couple of years ago, who was the quarterback for his high school football team and now coaches, he pulled me aside, he goes, that's the first book I've read cover to cover in a long time.
First book read cover to cover.
Yeah.
Out of Their League, folks.
Yeah.
It's a good read.
Well, I first met David in 1968. He and Rick Sortune, who started out as a Goldwater conservative guy,
He was my first convert.
and then he
Your
became
first what? Convert?
My first convert.
and then he became quite a radical union guy later in his life. And I say hello to you out there. They came to see Peggy Terry in Uptown, and she was a welfare mom who was involved in Joint Community Union, who we ended up running for vice president with Eldridge Cleaver on the Peace and Freedom ticket. And that's where I met these two big dudes, bigger than me. And I don't know, Dave
Michael
probably
is
wasn't.
impressed by that sort of thing.
And,
He's easy that
we
way.
shook hands, and then not too long after, I came down to St. Louis, and Dr. Spock was at your house, and you had the St. Louis
we had the anti-war movement
Washington
in our office in our
University
house.
SDS. You had a lot of steaks in your refrigerator. I was impressed with that. And then I ended up, a guy told me a couple years later, said, hey, Meggyesy got a book out, and you're in it. So we reconnected, and we've been running together ever since.
Right.
Phil I met. I'd heard about Phil and looked up to him. He and I both went to Nicaragua in '88 together, and
Yes.
we played a lot of baseball in prisons up in Esteli, and we were up above in Matagalpa, and we would play with Sandinista soldiers, and we had a pretty great time. And I remember you put on your Olympic jacket, and we had a press conference. It was good. Nicaragua was a fun time down there.
Yeah, in fact, the statement that I remember is that in Nicaragua, there's a shining light that goes from Nicaragua to all people in the world who are fighting tyranny and corruption. And of course, I got in trouble for it, but we had a good time down there.
Well, take note that de Blasio, the new mayor of New York, he spent a lot of time working in Nicaragua. So he's got good
That's
credentials.
good news.
Yes.
That's good news. So this is what, in Athletes United for Peaceland, are we one of the more active chapters here in Chicago? Phil or David?
Yes.
Yes?
I think that what you all have done with the
Using the Heartland mostly.
using the Heartland and having the 4 runs that you do every
5.
year, 5 runs, and one is going to be tomorrow.
Tomorrow
We
morning.
can talk about
Tomorrow
that.
morning.
Yeah.
And then the street sprints that you did. I mean, this is maybe Phil can talk a little bit about it, because Phil was involved with the formation of Sports for the People in New York. And when we talk about athletes, we're not talking about elite athletes. We're talking about, my view is every one of us as a human being is an athlete. And really what we're talking about is that spirit of being an athlete, that spirit of life, that spirit of exuberance and enthusiasm to really make the world how we want to see the world, which is a world that works for everybody. So that's the athletic spirit. And when you think about it, when Phil's story, the athletes have been the leaders in many ways, but they've been perceived as being behind the curve. When you look at Tommy Smith and John Carlos on the Olympic medal stand in Mexico City, their protest was about poverty in the African American community. It was not about their
and apartheid. It was
also
in
about
South
their being
Africa.
used as the athletes to kind of sell the American dream. But what they were really saying is, wait a minute, what is the American dream for people of my, as my late friend Gene Upshaw, who headed the NFL Players Association, was an African American, say, has to do with the paint job. And they really laid it out. And of course, those two guys were vilified and thrown out of the Olympic Village just because they basically said, let's take a look at what's really going on in the United States.
It was so courageous.
And it was incredibly courageous.
And it's still that photo can still move anyone who sees it.
Exactly.
Weren't they also affected, David, by the fact that the Mexican government had laid waste to
I'd like Phil to talk about it, because Phil actually was training with them at the Olympic training site at Lake Tahoe in California, and he knew them much better than I. I mean, but so if you want to talk about it.
Yeah, I was with Tommy up at South Lake Tahoe, and I'll just tell you one little story. So Tommy breaks the world record in the 200 meters, and he's coming down, and he's sort of walking and prancing and sort of jiving, and he walks by, and I was up in the stands with maybe 200 other white people, and so he comes along, and he looks at everyone. So he throws the apple right at me, and I grab the apple, and I take a bite, and I throw it right back, and he takes a bite, and he says, he says, all you honkies think that we don't like you. He says, look at that. You see that guy next to you? Couldn't you think he's my brother? Wow. Can you think that, he's a white guy, right? Right. He says, you think I hate you? I don't hate you. And so you just be good to my brother.
Speaking of brothers, I want to do a little shout out to Dave Zirin, who has written about sports in some wonderful ways. And Dave, I think, is listening in. He also is one of the people Athletes United for Peace here in Chicago has brought in to talk to people, along with Coach Russ Bradford, a number of people. We have these little events, and if you want to be on our mailing list, just get a hold of Michael at heartlandcafe.com or Katie at heartlandcafe.com, and we'll keep you in touch.
I think you were still answering a question, though.
Yeah. Well, your question was, is Chicago one of the places where they're organizing and doing? And the answer is yes. Chicago is like what we were doing for years, which is organizing, putting on events. But my shift has been the whole question of injuries in athletics. And I think Dave should talk about what he did with the National Football League Players Association on injuries. But for me, I grew up in a situation where people were taking steroids, they were taking amphetamines, they were ruining the whole aspect of sports. So what I did is I tried to develop a way that you can treat injuries without drugs and surgery. So I have a license in Chinese medicine, and I've been working with athletes at the Center for Dance and Sports Medicine for about 25 years. So we've developed techniques to help athletes without drugs and surgeries, and a lot of the surgeries 20 years later, it never really deals with the problem. But counter to that, Dave, when he was with the National Football League Players Association, did a lot for the athletes in terms of full pad scrimmages where people would get hurt. So the poor athletes had to have full contact in the game, and they had full contact in practice. So Athletes United for Peace is really deviated in the way of helping athletes with injuries, and we're involved with the United Nations with international programs. But the Heartland and the organizations for the races here are really have been over the years the essence of sports for the people. But there's other tentacles which I just mentioned.
That's
Right.
good to know. That's really good to
Yeah.
know. Go ahead, talk about that, David Meggyesy.
Talk about
Well, the injury aspect, or
The protection of athletes.
Well, I was involved with the NFL Players Association, which is the players' union, for 25 years, and of course, one of the things we were dealing with was synthetic turf, and we were dealing with the injury question, and it was absolutely necessary for the guys to have a union, an organization that protected them, because typically if a guy got hurt, they would cut him or release him, fire him basically from his job. And even though he was injured, it was too bad, see the door. And so we put together in collective bargaining protections for the athletes so they could be protected if they got injured. And then we've developed a whole range of programs post-career, because what we're seeing now is a lot of guys who played are coming down with this disease called CTE. It's a form of dementia, and it's called chronic traumatic encephalopathy. And it was just discovered about 7 years ago, actually. Specified as a very specific disease, and people knew that boxers get it, but now people are seeing that football players, even though you're wearing that helmet, there's a lot of guys out there who I played with who have this disease, CTE. And of course, people know about the suicide of Dave Duerson, who had it. Junior Seau had it.
Terrible loss.
And so there were some very prominent people who basically began losing it, their mental faculties because of CTE. Their brains have been autopsied. It's proven that they have it. So the big effort now of the union, and of course there's a great deal of concern about people playing football, and I want to tell everybody out there, don't let your kid play football when they're younger than 16 years old.
Yeah.
16 or younger, don't let them play. Play flag football, play soccer. I started playing football when I was a sophomore in high school. I was 16 years old and went on and had a 7-year career in the National Football League. You don't have to be playing football in Pop Warner, and where these brains, now the research is really focused on it, are incredibly vulnerable.
Yeah.
And it's a stupid thing to do. I mean, to have your kid play in Pop Warner when they're less than 15, 16 years old is frankly stupid. And you can have them play a lot of other sports where they're going to get what they need athletically, and if they want to go into play football after, say, age 16 when they're, say, a junior in high school, have at it. But that's my line on it, and I just want to emphasize that, how important that is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's my line on smoking pot too, actually.
Yes.
It is. It
yeah,
is.
well,
No, I think it's
That's
it's
good,
good to
okay.
wait until you're 15 or so.
I was 20, Kate.
I was 20 also.
We were of a different
old.
generation.
I was 30. We're talking about kids who have been smoking since they were 9. I think it's rough.
Yeah.
It's rough on their head.
Well, one of the things that Dave gets in on his emails, and I get them too, are these barrage of emails from a friend of yours named Matt
Cheney, yeah.
And he is quite a renowned author, but his mission is really to make football safe, or to not have people play at all.
Well,
there's a lot of stuff going on out there of people. I mean, there's injuries, there's deaths, there's discussions, there's battles over Pop Warner. Fill us in a little bit on Matt and the things he's written, like the Osage Indian book.
Well, Matt is an author. He played football at Southwest Missouri and tore his knee up. He tore everything in his knee except his femoral artery, he said, and suffered a major injury. His brother was a football player. He was a football player, really intense guy, and he got hurt. And he's an author, journalist, written 4 books, one on the Osage, but he wrote a book about how steroids or performance drugs came into football.
It's the definitive story.
And he's also now working on, has compiled a vast amount of information about how many kids, young people of the Pop Warner age, junior high age, are getting maimed playing football, and a number of deaths that have happened. And so Matt is compiling all this, and he's creating a clearinghouse to really let parents and people know what is really happening out there, because the National Football League, the NCAA, obviously they have a vested interest in wanting people not to know this information. And so at the most basic level, that's what Matt is doing, and an incredible service. Actually, I saw him. I was down in St. Louis yesterday, and we had a long meeting about it. And so if anybody's interested, just Google him, Matt Cheney.
Is it Cheney?
Cheney.
Okay.
And
no relation though to the
no, I'm
Powers.
sorry, it's Chaney.
Oh, very
and
good.
actually, their family, I found it because I stayed at his
Is he
parents'
related
house.
to Lon?
They are related a bit, long ago, but they've
love
divorced themselves from that wing of the family. So.
Hallelujah.
Yeah,
Hallelujah. So,
I
at any rate, check Matt's work out.
Yeah,
if you're
I wanted
interested.
to say one thing concomitant to what Dave is talking about, which is really the tradition of sports for the people and the protection of athletes, is what's happening international. And Athletes United for Peace has consultant status with ECOSOC. And one of the biggest problems in the world today is refugees.
Yes.
From Syria. And there's some 30 million people,
30 million people
all over the
refugees.
world who are in refugee camps with nothing to do. So one of the big things that Athletes United for Peace and sports organizations like us have been doing in the world in the last 10 years is providing sports for the refugees in these camps, because there's just really nothing to do. So that Athletes United for Peace always has two prongs, which is the domestic problems with mass sports and protection of elite athletes, but also the problems the world has are the things that we're interested in right now, which is the camps of the refugees, but also the relationship between Islamic, Christian, Judo, European relationships. So a lot of the things that Athletes United for Peace has done with Donna De Verona on the board, and also Lee Evans in Africa, is
Tell us about Lee in Africa. He's a prominent athlete.
We're still the world record holder.
Working in
isn't he?
Africa.
Yeah, Lee is the Olympic champion and world record holder in the 400 meters. But when he was in San Francisco, when he was a boy, he was in a class, and they were saying, talk about your family and stuff like that. And he said, I don't know the history of my family. And he said that immediately put him in a crisis. And he said, I don't belong in America. He said, I don't feel that I should be here, because I don't even know where I came from. And so Lee has spent his whole life in Africa, in all the different countries, coaching, and now he's in northeast Nigeria. And if you notice that a lot of the bombings and the violence in Nigeria, a lot of the violence in Nigeria is in the northeast, and that's where he is. And he's working with kids from 8 to 13 years old. And he told me that the region that he's from in the national championships won 5 medals, and after 2 years, say that there's 100 medals, they won 88 of them. And so over 2 years, he took these poor kids, and I said, Lee, what do you do? And he says, every kid, when they're young, I make them run a half an hour a day, and I lift Olympic weights. So he lifts heavy weights and does distance. And he says after about 2 years, they all become champions. In fact, the Nigeria national champion for youth was a kid who was so uncoordinated that he didn't even think he could make anything out of him. But after 3 or 4 years of just physical exercise, the guy became the sprint champion. So Lee has been in Nigeria, but when I go to Africa, he comes and stays at my house. He knows the whole history of colonization of every single country in Africa, and there's a direct relationship between how that power had in relationship to those countries. The best were the English, and then it was the French, the Belgians, and the Portuguese, and also the Dutch were further down. So all the politics of Africa all relate to the colonization, so that there are incredibly different problems in every single nation in Africa. And so we're very much involved with these things around the world. So we got 2 prongs. We got the stuff that Dave did, the things that we're doing at Heartland, and we're involved internationally.
For the second time in not that many months, I'm talking with white men, athletes, about race. And I like that. I like that the athletes that we know, because they have been athletes and because they have played and worked and lived with as brothers, people from everywhere, but especially African Americans here in the U.S., and it makes you much more of an ally. It creates allies out of you
Well, we
guys.
have more in common than we have with normal people because we compete at a high level and we respect each other. So
you're admitting you're abnormal.
yeah, I'm abnormal in every conceivable way.
Well, I
used to
think
be
one of the
thankful for
things
that.
about Athletes United for Peace and the programs that the former director, Guy Benjamin, who was a quarterback for Stanford, and then he would play 7 years in the league, who ran the organization. One of the things about sports, the main thing about sports, is it brings people together. You can't do sports independently. Even if you're skiing down a mountain or you're running a race, it's an independent thing, but you're doing it in relation to other human beings.
Right.
Now the question is what is the spirit of
That
that relationship when you're competing, you're working out, you're practicing, and the root word for competition is compiter. It means to strive together. So what athletes do with each other in competition is they strive together to make each other better, more capable what they're doing athletically. But that's what the athletic spirit is about, is to strive together to make this a better world. And I want to say one other thing too, which is we and the Greeks understood this. We have this book up here, people can see it. But the other thing I want to say is for people to, and there's millions of people in this country who do recreation sport. Those of you who aren't doing it, if you're so inclined, get your butt off the couch, start walking, start jogging, start running, and
You'll feel better.
Get into a sport that you go to the gym. Get into a sport that you really like to do. Make it something that you really love to do, and do it. Because the connection with sport and being healthy is established without a doubt. So just as a general message, move your bones, move your body, get out there and do stuff, and find a sport that interests you and do it. And you'll feel a hell of a lot better, and you'll have a better life.
Start tomorrow morning.
Yeah.
Be here by 8 o'clock.
Be here
We're
at
gonna do a
8 o'clock,
5K.
and there's going to be a 5K race tomorrow morning.
Katie
Yeah.
has said something very important, which is that with blacks and whites competing together, they find out they have more in common than they have almost with other people. So I really feel that my true brothers are like Tommy and John and Lee Evans, because we really are brothers. But at the same time, I've competed internationally, and so I have other brothers. I have Igor Taravanesian from Russia. I have Jacques Pani from France, or Lynn Davies from England, where I compete with them, and we have the same kind of symbiosis internationally as the black-white thing. So it really puts athletics where it should be historically, and Dave brought
bringing
this-
people together.
And it brings people
and
together.
also for peace. And this is an ancient tradition going back, 3,000 or 4,000 years, where the
1200 BC it started the Olympic movement in Greece.
I like to think that we take the wonderful experiences that we have on the playing field, so to speak, or in the ring, wherever it might be,
Right.
and that we take them to the next level, which is concerns itself with the issues that face humanity.
Exactly.
And we're looking forward to a place where we all can work together and make the world truly a better place. I want to thank both Dave Meggyesy and Phil Shinnick for being on the show today.
Yes, and thank you for all your work.
I want to let everyone know that next week we have a pretty good lineup. We're going to have a woman named Heather Levy, who is an anthropologist. She'll be in town, and she's going to talk a little bit about Lucho Libradores, or the Lucho Libre, the Mexican wrestling. She's also going to be here with Claudia Giannini, who was a Heartland bartender, and together they have a group called
Attractive Nuisance.
Attractive Nuisance.
Hey, anybody who remembers the Buffalo Bar in the 80s, a woman who never bartended without her crash helmet on, that's Claudia, and she and her partner will be on this stage next Saturday night.
An extra bonus treat in the musical front is Chris Bell, who is the owner over there at Flats and Sharp Music. She is going to be on the show talking about music and education. So
Ridiculously good.
Everybody who made the show possible. We got Nolan Chin downtown. We got Grant Stiskel right here. We got Hal James right here. We got Paul and Mary Wozniak right here. We need more and more people. We got Lynn Orman right here. We got a good group doing live from the Heartland. We'll be back
Thank
next
you, Nolan
week.
Chen.
Do good in the world. The world needs all the good that you do.
Thank you,
And
Michael.
power.
Thank you, Katie.
power
Michael,
to
thank
the
you.
people.
All right. 10 o'clock.
You're listening to 88.7 WLUW
Finish right on
Chicago
time,
Sound
yeah.
Alliance, broadcasting from the campus.